this is a sort of an inner and intellectual and truth-seeking journey that we are on.
Yes.
I say this with some amount of trepidation maybe, and some amount of what can you do about it, you know, kind of thing. And I believe, you know, I've been in this game of viruses don't cause disease since, you know, a guy I knew, Otto Wolff, told us in the late 80s. And I was part of the HIV doesn't cause AIDS sort of coalition, very much on the fringe. But I still came into this a year ago thinking there must be something to this virus thing. They must be doing something. They must have some role. And so essentially when I look back now, I went through every possible type of sort of explanation to make viruses, meaning particles of genetic material, relevant. You know, everything from the virome and the engineered virus, I never got into that, but the viral ecosystem and, you know, exosomes as messengers, until I figured out that the receptor that they were supposedly attached to doesn't actually exist. And I kept trying to shoehorn this into something that was important and real, and at the end of the day, I just couldn't do it. This is garbage. You blow up the cells, you make particles. Garbage has a certain amount of relevance, right? You know, if garbage is not garbage, you don't throw anything away. All garbage gets recycled, and someday somebody might find something that the garbage is doing, but these are, the issue is what blew up the cell, what blew up your tissue. Hang on a minute. What caused you to get sick? And then when that happens, you blow up the tissue, you make 1,000 million pieces of genetic debris. We call that viruses. Now, interestingly, and I didn't know this as much as I do now, but with the help of Andy and Stefan, and now lately Stefano, don't know his last name, and they've been schooling me on, you know, to get up to snuff, and particularly schooling me on the history of this. And this is not new. The guy who got the paper, a guy named Enders, 1957, Nobel Prize for discovering measles virus, and that virus was the cause of measles, says in this paper, for instance, Ruckel has lately reported similar findings, and in addition has isolated an agent from monkey kidney tissue that is so far is indistinguishable from human measles virus. In other words, the very paper that said he identified the virus said, by the way, we can't distinguish an exogenous from the outside pathogenic virus from particles broken down by the kidney tissue in our culture. 1957. And yet somehow he goes on and gets the Nobel Prize for discovering the virus. Later in the same paper he says, quote, there is a potential risk in employing cultures of primate cells for the production of vaccines composed of attenuated virus, since the presence of other agents possibly latent in primate tissue cannot be definitely excluded by any known method. In other words, we have no way in 1957 of distinguishing a virus from the outside from the breakdown particles of the monkey kidney tissue. Now you could say, well, yeah, but that was 1957, so now we're 64 years later. Here's a paper, Viruses, the journal called Viruses, believe it or not, May 2020, the role of extracellular vesicles, blah, blah, blah. Now, extracellular vesicles are the particles that come from the breakdown of our tissue. So the whole paper was devoted to, can we tell the difference between particles from our own tissue versus viruses infecting us from the outside? And the conclusion of their paper, and I quote, and I'll add a word in there, however, to date, a reliable method that can guarantee a complete separation does not exist. That's the end of it. We can't tell whether this is just debris from our tissues versus coming from the outside. And the reason we can't tell is because they're all coming from us. They just can't say it quite yet. Give it 20 years, and it will be one of those, and then it becomes obvious, right? We were wrong all along. All this stuff which we said were exogenous viruses, that's just us breaking down. So the question then, as Andy said, so why do we break down? Now, this is the most asked question I get. So why do we get measles? Why do we get chickenpox? Why do we see these particles sometimes and, not consistently in a child who has measles? Why even does it look like it's contagious? That becomes the number one thing that people get hung up on, right? That's what they want to know. Now, the first thing I would say is, if we're, hey, wait a minute type of people, we have to ground ourselves in the fact that with measles, there is no measles virus. With that hole in the ground, there's no plane. And that's just the facts. Now, interesting with measles, they actually had I'm sure most of you know this, a court case in Germany that went to the Supreme Court, sort of orchestrated by our friend Stefan Lenke. And the conclusion was, there is no evidence for the existence of a measles virus in the scientific literature. Now, some people could say, well, that doesn't prove it doesn't exist, but obviously you can't prove something doesn't exist. You can only say there's no evidence that unicorns do exist. And maybe someday they'll find it, so who knows, but unlikely. So we know that this situation, that this measles problem is not a virus. You just have to, that's just the facts. So once we know that it wasn't a plane in that hole, the next thing I would say is you don't actually have to have an explanation. And one of the reasons why it's tough to give an explanation is, you know how much research was devoted to finding out what crashed in that hole? None. You know how much research there is in finding out what actually happens to children with measles? None. So then when people say, yeah, but Tom, you don't have peer-reviewed studies to back up what I'm about to say, which I would admit is a hypothesis, that's true, sort of. I have some. And I try to piece together everything I can find. But that's part of the inherent bias of the system. So with that said, I'm going to give a stab at it. So what does cause these things? Because we have and it's also clear that I'm not denying people's experience that they get sick. And I'm not even particularly denying the experience, which I would say is inconsistent at best, that sometimes when you're around other people who are sick, you might have something that seems similar to. I would just caution that that's an inconsistent finding, but let's just go with it for now. So the way I'm going to do this is to present it like an imagination. And then we're going to go back and see whether the facts fit this imagination. So for instance, we start with the imagination and what the homeopaths have been saying for like centuries, that there's something called Genus Epidemicus, which means that these epidemics of childhood diseases come and go. They'll come for 100 years, 50 years, and then for no reason they go away, and nobody knows why this one came and why it went away. But there hasn't been measles for 2,000 years or months or so. It sort of comes and goes for reasons which are unexplained. So that's the first thing. The second thing is we know, and for those of you who want research on this, go to this book. There's a whole section on studies called Miller's Critical Vaccine Studies that show, as you know, so many of our natural healers, and the founder of osteopathy, and the founder of chiropractic, and the founder of anthroposophy, and a bunch of other people, everybody, every natural medicine system that has ever been, has said that when a child goes through this process that we call measles, they are stronger for life. Mm-hmm. Without any doubt. This is simply a maturation process which has been mischaracterized as an illness. Right. It's like a snake shedding its skin. And what you see from the studies is if you take a population and you prevent them, the children in that population, from going through these typical childhood illnesses, whichever ones there are in their age, they have more glioblastoma, brain cancer, chronic disease, asthma, eczema, heart disease, osteoarthritis, on and on. Every possible adverse health result you can imagine happens to children who are prevented from going through a maturation process. Now let's look at this at another point of view, and I would admit this is a theory, but it's a theory that I can guarantee you I didn't make up. A human being is more than a physical body. What? And different people characterize that differently. They have a soul and a spirit, or a chi, or, you know, there's lots of different ways. And one could say the purpose of childhood, imagine, again, I'm using an imagination here, you have this soul and the spirit who comes down and uses the physical substance as like a artist modeling clay, and uses a warmth and water and a sort of formation process to take this inherited structure and mold it into an instrument for its spirit. That is what we mean by childhood, period. And so the prediction is if you don't let a child do that process, you will have misfits. People whose experience of life is, I was thwarted from molding my physical body in a way that's congruent with my higher self, with my spirit, with my intention in life, and therefore I don't feel right. And what do we call that in a child? They don't feel right. They don't fit in their body. We call it ADD, ADHD. We call it asthma. They keep trying to do it in auxiliary ways. So instead of having 7 days of a harmless measles experience, they have 20 years of chronic eczema. And that is exactly what the studies show, that when we take a population and we use injectable toxins to prevent them from going through that, they go from 10% or so of the children have a chronic disease to 54% of them have a chronic disease. They are biological misfits, meaning their soul and spirit no longer fits, and there's some tension which they resolve through illness, and the therapy for that whole mess is the molding of the physical body through the soul and the spirit, using warmth, using elimination, using mucus, using rash, and as long as you see it like that, and in my 35 or so years of being a family doctor, and I gave approximately 5 to 7 plain tetanus shots during that time, that's it. And by the way, I regret every one of those. And if I knew more about tetanus, I wouldn't have given those. And I saw hundreds and probably thousands of children going through whooping cough and measles. You know, some of the Disneyland famous children were my patients. And chicken pox. I never once had a negative outcome. People were sick, they went through that experience, and then they were what we call better. Better than what they started.
Right.
Because the biggest misconception of all is the failure to understand the concept of blessed by illness, blessed by the experience of going through these elimination, remolding, detoxification processes that we erroneously have decided to thwart in all our various and sophisticated ways. And that is the biggest tragedy of all. So, what is measles? Measles apparently is the experience of kind of universal that children, whether it's because everybody's exposed to bad food or bad air or a certain kind of toxin, it may be a mental construct or something, that children in this 100 years, in order to mature properly, have to rearrange their physical body in this way through the otherwise harmless process of measles. And that's why it is 100% clear that the death rate was not changed by vaccines.
Right.
The incidence maybe, and maybe there's some dispute about this, and Andy and I have been talking about this, whether it's true or not, and it's an interesting question. I happen to think it's possible, and so how does it work? It seems possible to me, and I don't have the details, that you could take something from somebody who had measles, not a virus, and mix it with certain poisons, like aluminum, etc., or culture it with toxins, inject that into children, and essentially make them think that I don't have the space to go through measles because I have a bigger problem to deal with right now, which is aluminum or mercury poisons in my nervous system.
Right.
So now my attention is not going through this harmless process called measles, but is how am I going to detoxify from mercury and cell culture poisoning. So it seems like there's a lessening of the disease. What there is a changing of the guard to a far, far, far worse situation, which often lasts for life. If that's true, I can imagine the interesting and, at this point I would say, unknown ways that a child might communicate that to another child. Sort of like women, if you put 20-year-old women in a cabin for a year, they all start menstruating at the same time. There's this sort of biological resonance or synchronization that says, here's a normal physiological process, let's sing this tune together. I don't know why. They like it. Maybe it's more economical for parents. Anyways, I can imagine a child saying, it's time to go through this maturation process. So like a tree sending out a signal, here, my friend, you can do this, because anyways, your parents get it, and you're well nourished, and you've gotten enough collagen because you eat bone broth. And this is a harmless maturation, and you will be better for life. I can totally imagine that that's the case, even if I don't know exactly what the resonance mechanism of that. But that's only because we have such an incredibly impoverished view of social communication, and how biology really works.
Yeah.
Because I'm going to finish with, at the end of the day, and after reading in the last 6 weeks, 3,000 pages of Harold Hillman and Gilbert Ling and Stefan Lenka and talking with Andy, all I can say that exists in a human being as far as the tissue is we have blocks of water like Jell-O with a membrane like 2 blocks of Jell-O next to each other. You wouldn't actually say that's a membrane, that's a kind of border. And these blocks of Jell-O have stuff in it like minerals and lipids and amino acids and some other things. And then there's mitochondria. They don't have their cristae in the middle, that's an artifact. And then there's nucleus. And this whole thing is organized by the interaction of the sun and the moon and human beings in connection with each other through our love and our exuding positive energy to each other. All of those things organize our water into a living being. Believe it or not, they actually form de novo the proteins, because there's 200,000 proteins and 10,000 genes, and the idea that genes code for proteins is, hey, wait a minute. It's a whole different world. It's all got to do with the integrity of our water, with some stuff in it, the energy that we're exposed to, and if you change the energy, you make brilliant, crystal clear water that's going to heal the world. And now we'll hear from him.